I've always had some kind of affinity with the paranormal. When I was a teenager, I wouldn't stop writing extremely dark, creepy poetry. I've always been a loner, one best friend kind of person, if any. Anyway, onto the story. My parents divorced when I was young, and my mom became depressed and spent a lot of time alone. We moved in with my grandparents, and they gave us a little house near them. It was so close that we didn't have to walk 5 meters to reach their door. My mom always spent time there with them, but I preferred to be alone in our new little house. One time, I was sleeping in the dark. I dreamed that there was a guy with a black face sitting at the edge of my bed, just staring at me. I awoke, terrified, with that dreadful feeling that someone was there with me. I snapped out of bed, turned on the lights, and ran to my grandparents' house. I sat beside my grandmother and said, "That house can be so creepy." She casually replied, "Of course, 2 guys died there from gas while they were renting the place. We found them a week later." It was as if it was no big deal to her, but it felt like a slap in the face to me. That was only the warm-up, though. As I got older, my mom remarried, and my grampy moved to another house, 150 meters away from the previous one. I was left to rot in the old one, living alone for an entire year and a half in my grandpa's old house, which was big, old, and creepy. Even though their new house wasn't far, I still saw things there. Shadow people. I remember avoiding most areas in the house. My living consisted of staying in the living room, kitchen, and bathroom. I always felt like I was being watched. At the time, I was a student finishing my graduation project, so I didn't leave the house much except to buy groceries. There were 2 long hallways in the house. The first led to the bathroom, and the second led to my grandparents' previous bedroom. It was a big room and always locked since they kept their stuff there. When you stood in the hallway, you couldn't see the door at the end of it. It was just darkness. I always avoided that area. Sometimes, loud at night, I'd hear banging on the door around 2 or 3 a.m. I tried to brush it off and play courageous, since I had no choice but to stay there. I always locked the door to the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to fall asleep. The door didn't lock well, so I used a chair to secure it further. One night, I woke up burning with a fever, almost hallucinating, when I heard the chair move. That's when I saw it. A small, dark, shadowy figure sneaking a peek at me. I couldn't believe my eyes. I got up, switched the light on, and saw the chair moved out of place, leaving the door slightly open. I started crying and called my parents, but none of them answered. To be fair, it was 3 a.m. I prayed and tried to calm down, convincing myself I was imagining it. 2 months later, I was watching a YouTube video about the jinn with loudspeakers. For those who don't know, jinn are creatures in Islamic belief, equivalent to demons. The video stated that one of them could probably be watching you right now. I giggled and said, "I'm not scared." But I knew I'd regret that. That night, I played Quran recitations, as it said to keep shadow people and jinn away. At 2 a.m., I woke up to 3 shadow people dancing. One was by my feet, another near my head, and the third standing near my face. They were making a strange noise, almost like static. It was so unnerving. I screamed at them to leave me alone, and they disappeared. But after that, I began suffering from insomnia. I couldn't sleep at night, anymore and would stay up until daylight began peeking in. One night, I had a dream that didn't even feel like a dream. I started hearing whispers. Not gentle ones, but violent whispers, like a chorus from hell. The closest description would be the soundtrack from Dante's Inferno. Quiet, but loud, evil, and aggressive. The whispers always came from the same creepy room at the end of the hallway. I approached it in the dream, and a man emerged from the darkness. He was bald, short, and muscular, with veins bulging. He looked right through my soul. As he came closer, I started reciting prayers while hearing my cousin's voice, screaming for me to flee. Something was pulling me back as I struggled to move away. I finally escaped, gasping for air, and woke up to the same whispers. Later, my grandparents came to stay for a while. My grandmother always slept with the light on. One night, I woke up feeling strange and saw a giant little girl holding something in her left arm. Her eyes were wild, and she was grinning at me. Beside her stood a dwarf-like figure with grayish skin and a tail, staring at my grandma. I didn't know what to do, so I tried to go back to sleep and ignored them. Another time, I had a dream where I was conversing with something I couldn't see. They said, "You should let us in. Nobody wants you. Your parents left. We're the only ones who'll help you." I felt lost and desperate. When I opened my eyes, I was crying. One night, my grandma woke up screaming, claiming someone was running around her bed and throwing things at her. She blamed me, but I had no idea what she was talking about. We later found half her belongings burned near some candles, even though there was no fire source. Eventually, I graduated and moved out of the country for work, but even then, I couldn't escape the strange occurrences. One morning at 5 a.m., I woke up to find white fog surrounding my face. It lingered for a while, then turned completely black before vanishing. I still have no idea what it was. Story 2. When my mom was 6 months pregnant with me, she decided to play the Ouija board with her sister. My grandmother had died about 3 months earlier, and they wanted to try to contact her. My mom and aunt believed they had spoken to their mother, who had tragically died in that house. The session seemed normal until the planchette made a sharp movement. The air turned ice cold, and the planchette kept repeating, "Mine, mine, mine." Frightened, they stopped the session. A few weeks later, my mom unexpectedly went into labor. I was born prematurely, small enough to need 2 weeks in the hospital before going home. When I was 4, I began having horrifying night terrors. In the dreams, I sat at the top of the stairs, unable to move, as if stuck in quicksand. I screamed for hours, and every time, a black, long-limbed creature with burning red eyes would crawl towards me. Over time, I learned to wake myself up before the creature appeared, but the dreams persisted almost every night. I told my mom about the dreams, but she dismissed them, saying I shouldn't scare myself by staying up late. Her attitude changed, however, when my little sister began saying strange things. At 2.5 years old, my sister was very smart. One night during her bedtime game of spelling words, she suddenly said, "Mommy, can you spell black man veteran?" She sang it in a chilling, sing-song voice. That same night, I woke up to see an old lady standing at the end of my bed. She looked so real that I thought a stranger had entered my room. I screamed and turned on the light, but she was gone. I kept the light on out of fear, but I woke up in darkness again, only to see the same old woman. This time, her skin was blue, her teeth were rotting, and her unnatural blue eyes stared at me as she grinned. She began laughing, a giggle that turned into a manic cackle. Her mouth unhinged like a snake, and suddenly she stopped. In a low, guttural man's voice, she said, "If you're scared, cover your head, little piggy, because I'm not gonna stop." Terrified, I covered myself with blankets as she resumed laughing. I stayed under the covers for what felt like hours until I eventually fell asleep. When I told my mom about it, she called my grandfather, who was a pastor. He blessed the house, and things calmed down for a while. As a teenager, I moved into a bedroom downstairs while my sister stayed upstairs. Every night, without fail, I woke up to creaking stairs and footsteps approaching my door. The door would open and close slowly, but no one was ever there. When I was 17, my family finally moved out. Life seemed to return to normal, but one stormy summer night, my mom, sister, and I were lying on her bed when the power went out. We all decided to sleep early, but we woke up at the same time to see a towering figure standing in the doorway. It was at least 7 feet tall, and the room felt unnaturally cold. Then I heard the same laugh I had heard years earlier. The creature whispered, "I found you." And my entire body froze. It was the same black figure from my childhood. Years later, after moving to Florida with my husband, the encounters resumed. My husband worked late shifts, and one night, while smoking outside, I noticed a long black arm with claws stretching down from the roof as if to grab me. It was unmistakably inhuman. When I told my husband, he dismissed it as paranoia, until he saw the black figure on the roof himself. Now I can't help but wonder when it's going to try to come inside. Story 3.
I come from a military family, and as such, I lived all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty bad at making friends to begin with. This story starts after I had lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years at age 14. I had no friends, my home life was pretty terrible, and I was, at this point, pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land with a river separating us from about 1 million acres of raw forest that had a bunch of ATV trails in it. It was a spooky forest, and I have tons of stories about what I saw in there that makes most horror movies look like a joke. Of note is the bear trap forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But these are tales for another time. Around late August, my parents had told me, for many weeks now, there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was just some kids trying to break into our garage and steal some beer. There had been times I'd heard it too, normally in the evening, just a couple of voices periodically hollering. One night, I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. No big deal. A lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure as hell didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this happened for some weeks, I heard the kids doing their usual thing one afternoon and decided to see what was so amusing. I ventured into the woods and went about 300 feet along an ATV trail my neighbor used, where I met one of them. The kid I met was called Jack. He was a year or two younger than me, about a foot shorter, wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, but we said our hellos. I told him I had heard them for a while now and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped and insisted I follow him to his friend's project. I followed the guy. He was taken into an area that was pretty clear-cut in a dense patch of woods. I knew this area. I hung out in the woods alone a lot and explored, and this was brand new. There were 2 other kids there, one my age, named Elvis, and another older kid by about 2 years, called Louie. They said they were working on a treehouse fort and wondered if I would be interested in helping. I, of course, said yes. I had never been asked to hang out with anyone, and they showed me around. I need to discuss these kids' clothes. When I say out of style, I'm talking early 80s miserable fashion, neon colors. One kid had shoulder pads and was a mess. They wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say new, like they had no signs of pimples. Their hair was immaculate, and their clothes were crisp as hell. I just assumed they were hand-me-downs from their parents or something, as they stated that they were all friends, not brothers. These kids were nice to me. I never really got to know them. They never wanted to talk about their home life. But that isn't surprising where I live. We used hatchets, saws, ropes, and nails to make a pretty solid fort with about 8-foot walls made of birch trees. We made a table to sit at and a lookout post in the biggest tree we could find. The place was about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were all pretty proud. One day, we were sitting at the table talking about random things, and I asked Elvis why I had never seen him around before. If he lived near me, he had to go to my school. It was one of 2 schools in the town, and no way he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted he did, and wondered why he'd never met me either. We didn't know the same classmates, the same people, and could barely agree on teachers. But whatever, these kids talked to me, and that was enough. About 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, one day I said I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard, and my parents always made way too much food. They became downright hostile, not over the food. They just refused to cross the river, adamantly. Louis came up with a story about how crossing a stranger's river is bad luck. I didn't push the issue. I brought back a pie that we could all eat, and they apologized about getting angry, saying they were just very superstitious. I thought nothing more of it. About a week later, I went to the fort. The kids looked haggard. Jack was particularly bad. He looked like he had just gotten the beat down of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over. I asked if he was okay. He said he just had the flu, but they also looked wet. Maybe greasy is a better word. Their hair was sick, their skin shiny and clammy, and their clothes looked like a mess. I wasn't shocked. These kids wore the same clothes pretty much every day, but so did a lot of the really cool kids in town. The next day, I came back to the fort with a hatchet and a bag of nails, planning to work on the lookout roof. When I got there, the place was wrecked. The walls had been torn down, the table was in half, and the lookout was barely standing. Most notably, everything was rotting, like it had been sitting there for decades. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had been a solid half-tree floor. My only thought was, what the hell? I rationalized that maybe someone found out about the fort and wrecked it. I waited for the kids to come the next day, and the next, and the day after that. I waited a week, but never saw those kids again. I was dejected and eventually stopped waiting for them. I wanted to look for them, but they had never shown me or told me where they lived, other than up the hill. My parents noticed and asked me why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore. I told them what was happening, and they dismissed it, insisting they probably didn't want to be my friend. Cut to today. I'm 29, telling my wife about these kids I used to hang out with and the fort we made. It's a good memory with a sad ending. My wife looks at me wide-eyed and says, "You hung out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids." At first, I found this crazy, but she asked, "Did anyone else see them?" No one had. My parents saw flashlights and heard voices, but never saw the kids. There were no records I could find about them, no one in school who knew them, and they never showed me their house. My wife says it's spooky and that I should probably share this story with you. What do you guys think?